to the second session of this symposium. I mean, I think we've had a very exciting, very inspiring, and at the same time chastening, I think, discussion with Nelson Maldonado Torres this morning, which offers us some pointers to understanding with the situation that we're in and where we can go from here, and some pointers towards what not a decolonized university but a decolonizing university might look like. And perhaps, you know, this is one such kind of space or moment in a decolonization project which will outlast us. Many of us will be in our graves when the final decolonized university emerges from the ashes of the colonial university. So it's very exciting to have, as a follow-up to this morning's discussion, a panel of three such wonderful and exceptional people. And I'm sure we're going to have some fireworks. We've started a bit late because the earlier discussion had to go on. It could not have stopped at the scheduled time break, and I suppose that's about decolonizing temporality. And if it's okay with our panel and with at least many in the audience, I would suggest that we go on until about 1:30 this morning. Otherwise, we won't have time for engagement. But if I can just briefly introduce our panelists. So Zimitri, Erasmus, well, none of them actually need any introduction. But, you know, maybe there's someone from far away, maybe Nelson would like to hear who's speaking. For that, I'll just say a couple of words. So Zimitri Erasmus, Professor Zimitri Erasmus, is in the faculty, in the School of Social Sciences, and she teaches in sociology, is an associate with the Wits Institute of Diversity Studies, and her research interests include the place of decolonial praxis and processes of creolization. And she is the chair of the Faculty of Humanities Transformation Committee. Not Change Management Committee. Thanks, Dimitri. So our other two panelists are one student in this process of dialogue told us a few days ago that they should be regarded not as subordinates, not as apprentices, not as people in waiting, but as the brilliant professors of the future, and we should treat them as such. So I'm really glad to also have on the panel two brilliant professors of the future. And I hope the not too long distant future, in other words, not the 20-year future, that professors are steeped in UCT apparently, but also probably in this university. So Moshibudi Motimele is a PhD student in the Department of Politics. She is also a Think Fellow, which means that she, as I understand it, she's a participant in an accelerated program of thinking. Because, of course, we all think fellows, but she's like a think fellow. And her primary, that's in the graduate center, I think. And her primary research interests are precarious subjectivities and the ways in which those on the margins can bring out a new politics. And that speaks, I think, to the kind of politics we were talking about this morning. Now, Mbuyiseni, I mean, he's our representative in Parliament. He's a...
Does it mean you voted EFF?
Sure. We have to. There's no alternative. So Mbuyiseni is also really, I mean, apart from being a brilliant MP and a brilliant spokesperson for the EFF, I'm really hoping that he is still that brilliant professor of the future that we can see his pathway towards. He's in the middle of an exceptional PhD work, working with Fanon in a way that I don't think, I certainly haven't seen before, and at the same time in a very grounded, empirical way, with schooling and with youth formation in the Vaal area, on the cusp of you know, the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, and democratization, for what that's worth. So it's wonderful to have you all here, and no more about that. I think we go straight into talking. So Zimitri, I'm going to give each panelist 15 minutes thereabouts to allow for time for engagement.
Okay. Hi everybody, and thank you for coming. I think I'm going to start with just a little bit of a link to Maldonado Torres's talk, and also just one link to the idea of, you know, us sitting here at a table with our future professors. So I teach a course called Social Transitions with my colleague Shireen Ali. And the most powerful moment in the first year of that course last year was when a writing fellow who was, you know, working with the course. It's a writing intensive course. And what I would do is the first half of the seminar, you know, I would facilitate seminar discussion. And the second half of the seminar was basically the writing fellows were the authorities in class. And this is what Lerato Bosholi, who is a philosophy student, said. One day we will have officers here critiquing decolonial theory. And I'm like, yeah, that's the point. Right? That is the point. The only difference I had was that she said, when I am 60, or when we are 60, we will have officers here. And I said, you cannot possibly wait until you're 60. It's got to happen before then. So that's the link to, you know, engaging with future professors, sitting at the table here. The link to Maldonado Torres's talk is that Kopano Vatele, in 2003, wrote a piece in which he kind of opens Biko up, and what he presents is the uncertainty with which Biko left us. And I think that, for me, talking about the gift that Black consciousness gives us today, that gift is the gift of uncertainty for me. There is a place in I Write What I Love where he, in one moment, sees Black consciousness as, and I quote, a prelude to anything else that may come. So, now what I'd like to do is I cannot possibly talk about decolonizing the world. So I'm going to be talking about what does decolonizing the academy mean for me at Wits at this time. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a sense of what it means for me. And it's probably it's a small sense, it's not the whole thing. And then I'm going to take you into the classroom, one of my classrooms, undergraduate classroom, and a postgraduate classroom. Connect that to what decolonizing the academy means for me. And then I will take you to a letter that Sylvia Winter wrote to her colleagues 22 years ago. And that would then open up the space for us to, hopefully, to think. And this letter is the first reading for some of the future professors who are in social transitions with me. Thank you for coming. So, for me, decolonizing the academy is much more than the affirmation of subjugated knowledges. People who live and experience various iterations of subjugation are aware of these knowledges. They use them daily, and sometimes engage these subjugated knowledges critically. It is not, in my view, for the academy or for dominant forms of knowledge to affirm these knowledges. The project for me is about building from the thought locations of subjugated knowledges various critiques of the Academy's colonial library and of ways it colludes with the coloniality of power. The project for me is about ways the epistemic apertures of subjugated knowledges could unsettle normative ways of seeing, being, and doing in the worlds of both, very importantly, both the dominant and the subjugated. For it is by no means inevitable that life on the other side of power automatically produces critical thought imbued with a will to emancipation. I want now to turn to students in my classrooms. In a first-year class of 500, I appealed to students to think for half the time they spend reading. One student asked, "Miss, what does it mean to think?" The class burst into anxious laughter, in all likelihood relieved that someone dared to ask what could be considered a naive question. My first inner thought was, what is wrong with our education for such a question to emerge from a first-year student at university? And then, reflecting on my own learning and teaching journey, I have come to see this as a major question many young South Africans have of the world. What does it mean for me to think about you, world? What does it mean for me to have questions about you, world? And in order to get students to think about, those questions, what I find happens in the classroom is that a whole lot of passion emerges, which for me is the emotion to Dilip's contribution. That for me is the emotion appropriate for a university. Not cool and calm reasoning, but passion. Passion for thinking, passion for learning, passion for arguing, passion for disagreeing, passion for reading, for writing, for engaging. Now, given this classroom scene, decolonizing the academy necessarily means investing in young people's curiosity about the world and in the questions they have of the world. Remaining with students in my classrooms, moving to the postgraduate scene, for 2 years I've been co-teaching a postgraduate course that engages the arrogance and violence of metropolitan social theory. What strikes me is that each year, and it's only been 2, I'm in the last week of the course, of my part of the course now, what strikes me is that each year, I'm restricted by sitting, each year, several participants in this class come to the conclusion that everything to do with Europe has to be obliterated. Everything to do with Europe has to be obliterated. That we must find the roots of African thought, the ROOTS's, not the ROUTES's. And that we should start from a clean slate. Now, in the context of eons of de-valorizing Afrikaner thought, one can empathize with this response. Fortunately, this response comes in the first half of the course, giving us time to move through this empathy to its other side, and so to begin exploring the reality that there is no immaculate Afrikaner thought. There is no immaculate past to return to. And in this vein, decolonizing learning and teaching is less, for me, about a return to roots. It is more about considering ways various knowledges have shaped and have wounded each other in the context of the dynamics of colonial power. It is more about considering how to move forward from this necessarily contaminated and painful place. One of the implications of such consideration for me is that decolonizing teaching and learning means working toward living with and along the colonial wound, as opposed to living through that wound. Well, what are some of the conditions that enable learning to live with and along the colonial wound? One of these conditions is the capacity to sit with incongruities between, on the one hand, what we know, and on the other, the newness offered to us by the world each day. Another condition is time for reflection. A third is the capacity to doubt. A fourth is the capacity to love. And I mean here love in its wider sense of the word. While I am not always in agreement with everything that surrounds Fees Must Fall, as a teacher, I am indebted to this movement for making the classroom a more exciting, even if a more difficult space. So now, having gone to the undergraduate classroom, from the undergraduate classroom to the postgraduate classroom, I now want to close by turning to the staff room. I was struck by two issues that emerged from the first faculty-wide conversation about curriculum transformation that we had in the humanities faculty, organized by Ahmed Valieva and Tishani Nag. One issue that I was struck by is the stubborn presence of what I call a decontextualized, ahistorical, and anti-political idea of academic autonomy. And that kind of academic autonomy in a context so clearly marked by a long history of epistemic injustice. I just am really struck by it. The second thing I'm struck by are the structural dances that academics choreograph to avoid concerns about the politics of knowledge and the politics of pedagogy. And some of these dances include curriculum change, or should we call it curriculum strangulation? Because change happens because people go on sabbatical, because someone new is hired, because someone has a pet project, because some of us subscribe to disciplinary apartheid. Now, given these two patterns, this decontextualized and anti-political idea of academic autonomy and the dances of curriculum strangulation, as academics, we would do well to reflect on Ahmed Bauer's question, articulated in New South African Review 4. What is the knowledge project of our university? And in order to begin to engage this question, for this we might need to distinguish between the academic project and the knowledge project, in order to productively engage this pregnant moment in the academy. So 22 years ago, Sylvia Winter wrote a letter to her colleagues in the aftermath of the acquittal of the policeman who beat Rodney King in LA. And she tells them, she tells her colleagues, and she tells us that the legal cases in which the rights of young, poor black men in LA were violated, those cases were officially classified as no humans involved, NHIs. She notes the judicial officers who came up with this classification were among the brightest and the best US graduates. Graduates that she and her colleagues would have had in their classes at university. So she asks her colleagues, what is our responsibility for producing graduates who can only conceive of humans in white and middle class terms? What do we as academics have to do with a conception of the world which banishes black people and poor people from our moral obligation to fellow humans? She notes that if systems of knowledge are so key to the ways we see the world, then it follows that intellectuals in and outside today's academy hold the key to undoing prescriptive race, class, gender, colonial categories of our time. If we hold this key, the onus is on us to call for and to invent new systems of knowledge together with our students. Systems of knowledge that undermine and contest those systems that enable our best and brightest graduates to come up with categories like no humans involved. In other words, we need to ask ourselves, could someone please close the door? In other words, we need to ask ourselves, what is wrong with our education? What is wrong with what we teach and how we teach it? How can we change this? And not just change it now, but change it continuously so that the courses, the content, and the pedagogy move with the student body. How do we work with the reality that there would be no killing of Marikana's miners if that killing did not start in the classroom? Who made the decision to shoot and keep shooting at Marikana? Where did these decision makers learn that black miners' lives were worth absolutely nothing? So, on that heavy note, I want to thank Alberto for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I'm deeply honored to share a platform with you, Nelson, with Shiburu, one of our most thoughtful doctoral candidates, and with Honorable Mbuyiseni, who refuses to be lulled into inaction, as you said at your last talk. And while I cannot bring myself to call you commandant, I do have great respect for your refusal. Thank you.
Thanks. Is there some water around that some of our speakers need to drink? Thanks, Zimitri. Certainly one of the brilliant professors of the present. Without further ado, Shibu, if I may, over to you. But should we swap chairs so that you face the full page? Or stand if you want, if you need the freedom to stand. Okay.
I think the term professor is one that can't be divorced from a type of hierarchical system, right? That privileges not only certain epistemologies, but mastering certain techniques of repression to achieve that status. So although I know the comment was made in good faith, I don't want to be considered a brilliant professor of the future, but rather a future in which hierarchies like professor don't exist anymore. I didn't have the privilege of reading Nelson's paper before today, and so the things I wanted to speak about are a bit separate, so I think what I'm going to try to right now is go back and forth between my notes and try bring together what were the things I was thinking with some of the points Nelson brought forth to us. And I was really interested in the naming of this discussion, Decolonizing the University and Decolonizing the World, because it made me think about what is the relationship between the university and the world. Or more importantly, what is the relationship between the colonial university and the continuation of colonialism in what officially people want to call a decolonized society. And in a chicken-egg type of formulation, what came first, we know that it was the colonial world, right? And then the modern university then becomes one of the tools used to further epistemological imperialism, right, or colonialism. And so what is the potential then of that space to speak against colonialism when inherent to its existence is the perpetuation of colonialism? And I think that's an important question that we as students have to consider. Nelson made the point about the division of the disciplines and how the coloniality of that as well is built in a particular type of way, which took me back to a discussion Lewis Gordon gave last year, where he spoke of critical consciousness, right? And critical consciousness asking not only whether systems are consistently applied, right, is where students started, that the system is not fair on the black child, it's easier in terms of pedagogy, in terms of funding, etc., to get through the system as a white child, but also whether the system themselves are compatible with other projects, particularly humanistic ones. And I think that's the question where we are now, right? Having to interrogate to what extent a space which must exclude to exist, right? Which must alienate certain perspectives can then be used to speak back. And it's disconcerting for me in discussions within student movements and within the academy on decolonization for the absence of interrogation around power. And I think it's more important for us to be speaking about power as a concept of oppression rather than the affirmation of blackness or race or the coloniality of disciplines, because we know that power exists in all spaces, right? And if we start speaking about power and the tools that power uses to exclude, to alienate, to marginalize, then we can start speaking to the problems that the student movement itself has to deal with, right? When we speak about power, it also gives, I think, a language for those people who are trying to deal with the ways in which the radical politics that have been adopted appear both aesthetically and in discourse to be extremely masculine, right? Well, what is it about the masculinity of black radical politics that students are now trying to invoke for some type of emancipatory project? What does it say that to exist in what people want to call leadership, right? Even not to be a man, to be a woman, you have to perform that same type of radical masculinity. What does it mean when we close down the space to speak about things such as sexism, patriarchy, and misogyny because we want to totalize the experience of blackness, right? This isn't the space now. There can be nothing worse in the university than to be black, right? So then why do we have to consider this category of woman? Right? The dismissal we get is, well, gender is also a colonial invention, right? Feminism, right, is tied to liberal white feminism, right? And so if you want to speak out against the type of masculine power that emerges even in the circles of movements, you're automatically dismissed as being, well, that's liberal white woman stuff, right? Or you dismiss that, well, woman is gender, is a colonial construct. So why are you as a black person, right, the primary basis of your exclusion, invoking something which doesn't even exist? And I think for me, a moment when I really wanted to take that seriously is when I had